G'day, I'm Travers. This is our subject for our video on drawing lines in our work that enhance, that contribute to, that work with what we're trying to achieve in our drawing, rather than ending up with lines that somehow even fight against what we're trying to achieve. What I'm going to do first is two demonstration drawings. The first is to do a drawing that ends up looking the way many drawings I see looking. Now, you may or may not think you'd be pleased if it's something you'd drawn, but it took me just under half an hour to draw in real time. The second demo drawing is of the same scene, but it's utilizing some of the techniques of our line work that I want to then talk about in comparing the two drawings after that. This second drawing took me just under an hour to do in real time. So I'll then highlight the differences in the line work with the second drawing that I think have made it a much stronger depiction of this scene than the first one. And most of the points I'm going to be describing are actually easily taken up. They're things that I don't think will be very hard for you to put into practice if they're techniques you're not already using in your line work. And can I say that at the very end of the video, I'm going to include 5 minutes real-time drawing of the second demo drawing. So if you're interested in observing my technique as it appears line by line, rather than in something very sped up, you might like to hang around to the end and just watch those 5 minutes. But now, let's get this first demo drawing done. Now, as you watch this, remember, this is going to be the example of what not to do, so you don't need to pay too much attention to it, but I thought it would be interesting for you to see it appear, and also to realize that I did actually put quite a lot of time into this. This did still take me, as I said, 30 minutes to do, and yet it only took twice as long to end up doing what I think is a really quite improved drawing. And I think it is a good thing to realize that sometimes it doesn't take too much more time to turn a drawing from something which is in some ways a bit ordinary to something that really captures more of what appealed to us about the scene in the first place. This is a scene where, whichever way we draw it, there is still a lot of lines, and there's still a lot of observation to be done, and there's still a lot of untangling to do to draw anything at all. So if I'm going to commit to that, I really might as well make an effort to get the most out of the time, even if it's just a little bit more time. So I'm just about finished this now, and then I hope that you'll appreciate the difference that the second demonstration drawing shows in just what sort of effects we can create with our line work if we make some more considered choices about lines that we're going to have to draw anyway in most cases. It's just that we can do it to better effect. As I said earlier, I don't know whether you'd be pleased or horrified if you'd drawn it, but here it is. So I want to move straight into drawing this now a second time, but utilizing some of the techniques I'll then talk about when we compare the two. I don't know if this is the sort of scene you like to draw or whether it's the sort of scene you have experience in drawing, but this section of the buildings that face Trafalgar Square in London is the sort of thing I particularly enjoy drawing, and the sort of scene and viewpoint and variety of what we actually have and the perspective that we have to draw it from that I enjoy, because even the same architectural elements, when we see them from different positions, create, I think, a lot of visual interest, and it's just the sort of thing I enjoy drawing. So this was a lot of fun for me to observe, and I have drawn it before in a different context, so I have a bit of familiarity with it as well. And of course, this is now the second time I've drawn it in a row, and that means I have already observed it carefully. Although in this case, it's going to take me twice as long, just under an hour, to draw this way. Now, I'm not going to comment on how I'm actually drawing it, because in a moment, I'll compare the two drawings together. But you might like to see if you can observe some of the differences at this point before I point them out. It's a great drawing, and if you think this is the sort of drawing that, oh, that's just too hard for me to draw, everything is just line by line. Now some subjects do have more lines than others, so if the subject doesn't interest us enough to have that time commitment to draw it, then it's just not a good choice of subject for us. But it's not because it's complex. If we choose a subject that we in effect enjoy spending time with, then it becomes a labour of love. But if we're going to put lines on the paper, we really do want to make sure that we're putting them to best effect. And a line is not a line. It's not just whether it's a straight line, but it's how we draw it, and how we want to draw it will depend on whereabouts in the drawing it is. And that's a lot of what the discussion is going to be about, but by no means the only part. And while this might look fairly complex, once we get that first, if you like, vertical section of windows stacked on top of each other, then we simply move horizontally in each direction. And as we move out horizontally, we can then again move up and down. Sometimes scenes that look complicated actually are pretty straightforward. Once we've established a relatively small part carefully, we can then use it to measure off most of the rest of the drawing. And when I draw these buildings to the side, I'm looking to see where the divisions before the floors are by comparing it with the building next to them. And if I can keep everything in proportion, it actually becomes fairly straightforward. And also, once we get to this part, it's very forgiving of mistakes, because we're not in the end looking at the detail up here at the end of the street closely enough. It's really the overall effect. It's a lot like drawing leaves or a field of flowers. We're creating the effect of this architecture rather than drawing the exactness of it. It's an incredibly important and helpful technique to learn. So here we have our second drawing. As I said, it took just under an hour real time. I don't know whether you're already anticipating some of the things I might say, but let's compare the two side by side so that we can not just identify what I've done here, but we can see the impact it has on our work. Here are our two drawings then. I think the most obvious difference between the two is that for this first one, I used the same pen for the whole scene. I used a 0.5 millimeter fine liner. For this drawing, I used a 0.5, a 0.3, a 0.2, and a 0.1 millimeter fine liner. So it lets us see straight off the visual effect of being able to change our line thickness. Now, of course, we can change our line thickness by how much pressure we apply as we draw, and also by how quickly we move our nib across the paper. But when we actually change pens, we can guarantee a more consistent manipulation of line. I change pens because, in my opinion, one of the ways we create the effect of distance is to be drawing the things further away with a lighter line. If we look at our scene, here we can see that this section of the building is closer to us than these objects here as Whitehall moves further away from us. And these buildings here are still closer to us than these turrets and domes and chimneys popping up in the distance as well. So the first thing I did was to produce a diagram to help me sort out what I was going to do. So I decided that I would use my thickest pen, my 0.5, for this section of the facade that was closest to us. So by using a heavier line, I conveyed the fact that this section of the building was closest to us, so I'm starting the creation of a feeling of depth. And I'm also, by creating a section of darker line, controlling where people first look at my drawing, because they will be attracted to this darker strip and then they will move from there. And I've also decided that I'll make this tree 0.5 as well, because I want it to be in front of the building. I don't want to have the sense that they're all at the same level and just somehow tangled up and overlapping. I want a sense of this is closer to us than the building. So then I'm going to use 3 millimeters for the next closest bit. So I'm going to use it for this side of the building and also for this other side of the building and for the building next to it as well. Then I'm going to switch to a 0.2mm pen for this section here, and then go to a 1mm pen just for these very top parts and the very furthest parts here down the street. We've created both these drawings by using line, but there were some things I was able to do because I changed my pen in this drawing that I couldn't do in this drawing. Because I was using finer and finer pens as our buildings got further and further away, when foreshortening began to move all the details closer and closer together, with my finer pen I had more options for which lines I included and which lines I didn't. By continuing to use the one pen only, I simply didn't have enough space to put as many lines as I might have liked to have used without them just joining up and becoming quite black next to each other. I particularly didn't have room to put an extra line to indicate depth of a lot of the architectural elements here that wouldn't have simply merged together, whereas in this drawing I was able to put many additional lines very close to a first line, particularly with vertical lines, to indicate depth. And so we get a far more three-dimensional effect here than we were able to get here. This has a sense of being a facade where things come out and move in, whereas particularly this section looks as if it could be more just drawn on cardboard. It has a very flat look. When the space was simply too congested for the size pen I was using, the only thing I could do was to leave lines out. And that means that this drawing has really a great emphasis on, if you like, the major lines. And the major lines often end up being the outlines. And yet we're not drawing outlines or silhouettes, we're drawing three-dimensional form. And while outlines can be very helpful at times, emphasizing an outline over the lines that suggest form will always create a flattened effect. And if we look at this, this very much gives the effect of almost being just drawn on a sheet of cardboard that you could cut out and prop up. It looks very two-dimensional. The only thing that gives it a sense of possible roundness is this curved line here, slightly curved line here, and the fact that these windows narrow as they go around the corner. But if we were only looking at this, this could just be a stylized picture of some very skinny buildings. There is no sense of them moving away from us particularly, or of having a surface that moves in and out with various components. So it's very important with our line work to choose appropriate pens. Now, sometimes we're out sketching or just doing a very quick drawing, and so we will just use the one pen. And in that case, we'll do our best to, as I mentioned earlier, vary the angle we hold the pen, the pressure we use, and how fast we move the pen on the paper to create lines of darker and heavier or lighter effect. But when we get to choose, the first thing we should do is choose what combination of tools to create lines will work best for the effect we're trying to create. And if I'm trying to do a somewhat stylized, distorted view that captures some essence of a scene, then this could well be what I'm wanting, and I could deliberately choose perhaps a heavier, thicker line and do the whole thing in that. But if I'm wanting to create a sense of depth, then this is a much better way to go. And I do have a video that talks about the importance of planning our drawing before we start. Not of doing a thumbnail, simply looking at the strokes we're going to make, the ways we're going to create a sense of texture or shape, and to see whether what's in our mind, how it's going to look when we put it onto paper. And for me, that includes changing the pens I'm going to use. And for me, that includes changing the pens and trying out the pen thicknesses that I think I'm going to use. As you can see in this recent drawing for a video and the preparatory sketch I did beforehand, not just was I trying out how I would create the marks I wanted to use, but I was changing pens. So you can see I have a 0.5 here and here. Up here at the more distant parts, I've got a 0.1 and a combination of 0.2 and 3 in other parts. So it's not just trying out how we'll create the effect, but it's also seeing how the line thickness will work with that and whether it will create the effect that we want. And by focusing on the major lines, we do end up losing a lot of the visual interest, a lot of the small detail that we have still got room and space to put if we're using a finer pen. Things I draw more exactly here, I merely suggest often through simply drawing the shadows. I suggest what features are on these walls by drawing the negative space of the shadows they cast. Another way our line work in this drawing, I think, works against creating the sort of drawing that we want is by creating, if you like, patterns or symbols in a few places instead of trying to draw what's actually in front of us in the reference. So we've had a very close look at the roof here and the slate tiles, and instead of making the assessment, do I need to draw them at all? When I glance at this building, am I really aware of the tiles? And I don't think we are, certainly not in a drawing that we're only going to spend an hour doing. And clearly though, when I drew this, I'd stop looking at the reference and I'm thinking, oh yes, tiles, they look like this. And I do what looks in fact more like bricks than tiles. And so what I've done is I've not actually even drawn what's there, but I've used what's in effect a pattern to represent whatever real lines and effect were in the drawing. This tree is also more a pattern than a reality, or a symbolized version. I've looked at a very complex series of lines where there's lots of small lines so close together they've created almost an effect of fuzz. But instead of looking at that particular scene and thinking, how can I create that effect with my lines, I've reduced it to a lot of wriggly snakes and short lines. A very literal, in effect stylized depiction of what I'm looking at. Whereas in this one, I've tried more to create the effect. And by not carrying the hatching for the shade of this section of the building behind the tree, I've created the effect, in fact, that this tree is basically opaque. We can't see right through it. Even though the individual lines that make it opaque are in fact too small for us to draw, it still creates the feeling that this shadowed wall is moving behind a tree of very small, fine, dense branches and twigs. So these are all choices that we make with our line work, and I think part of the problem is we're far too quick to put our lines on paper when we haven't thought with our mind the best strategy to create the effect that we need to create to capture our scene. The biggest challenge in drawing is not putting the lines on paper, it's knowing what type of line we want to put and where we want to put it, and to have a sense of what purpose it's going to have. Because if our purpose is merely to outline an object that we see, it's going to look more like this. But if our purpose is to create an effect that has captured our imagination and attention, then we have the opportunity to actually creatively work out in our mind, what lines do I need to put where to create the effect, to capture what it is about this scene that intrigues me or excites me or interests me enough that make me want to draw it. I hope you found this interesting, but if you found it inspiring or motivating, then I hope you go to my channel community page and print off a copy of this drawing and have a go drawing it yourself and see if in some way you can plan your line work perhaps in a more purposeful way than you have in the past. So if you want to watch me draw 5 minutes of this in real time, then don't go away. But whatever you're drawing and however you're drawing it, make sure you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.